Okay, good afternoon. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Spring 2022 Media and Politics Cafe. I'm Associate Dean Rory Sinersha of the John Hazen White College of Arts and Sciences. It's great to be here with you and our distinguished panelists. I'd like to thank our panelists for agreeing to participate and being here today for the benefit of our students and campus community. The Media and Politics Cafe began in 2016 with the launch of our political science major. Over the years, we have covered an array of interdisciplinary topics ranging from biases and systemic racism adversely impacting people of color during pandemics, to public trust in the media, and most recently, the broader historical and contemporary impact of cannabis criminalization and legalization. Today's discussion will be no different. This afternoon, we will listen to our distinguished panelists discuss the importance of diving deeper, the priority of the learning process, which is vital to comprehending the complexities of those multitude of voices at any table at any given time. But most importantly, we will learn, or shall I say relearn, the importance of listening. As John Delavolpe, who is joining us today in his book, Fight, How Gen Z is Channeling Their Fear and Passion to Save America, states, and I quote, "Generation Z is asking us every day to have honest and difficult conversations about politics, race, culture, our history, and future. They are not waiting on anything or anyone. They are going to force the issue. They make the change happen by themselves if necessary." Johnson Wales University and the College of Arts and Sciences is firmly committed to nurturing and further strengthening an inclusive and equitable environment that embraces the broad range of diversity of all members of our community. We accept and celebrate diversity in every form, including thought. We strive to inspire a standard of excellence for all members of the Wildcat family and seek to foster an equitable environment where differences are valued and integrated in all aspects of university life. My goal as Associate Dean in the College of Arts and Sciences is to continually innovate and promote programs that not only supports the spirit of thought, but a space where we can all come together to engage in a variety of issues, but most importantly, to listen. It is now my distinct pleasure to hand the program over to Jim Hummel, who has been a reporter in Rhode Island for 40 years across all mediums. Hummel's career has mirrored the changes in the journalism profession over the past 3 decades, starting his career at the Providence Journal, moving to television where he won the Edward R. Murrow Award for investigative reporting. In 2009, he founded the Hummel Report, an online nonprofit investigative website. In 2012, he created the Rhode Island Spotlight for Rhode Island PBS, where he is also the station's weekly public affairs program, a lively experiment. Mr. Hummel, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Rory, and it's great to have you with us here in person and all of you watching on live stream. I'm really excited, folks. We have an all-star panel here today. Some I've known for a very long time, Mr. McKay. Others I have just met within the last couple of days. But as you see, their resumes are very impressive. So let me just introduce you to the panel before we get going. And just a reminder, we're gonna have a panel discussion, then we're gonna leave about 20 minutes at the end for your participation with questions that you may have. So be sure and get those ready. Let's begin with John Delavolpe. He is the director of polling at the Harvard Kennedy School Institute of Politics, where he has been a leader for more than 2 decades in trying to understand the youth of America through his polling. And he is the author of this book, which Rory referenced, Fight, How Gen Z is Channeling Their Fear and Passion to Save America. He was hired by the Biden campaign in the summer of 2020 as an advisor with an emphasis on youth polling. John, welcome.
Thank you for having me. I just will say quickly, it's such a pleasure to be Just say it's great to be back in Providence. 2 decades at Harvard. The decade before that, I spent many days and nights, weekends here, learning more about politics probably during that period than at any other period of my career. So it's good to be back, and thanks.
And helping with the campaign too, right? To John's right is Xingjing Shen. She hails from Cleveland, is a junior at Harvard studying chemistry and government, and she is chair of the Harvard Public Opinion Project. Gun violence and mental health activism drew her to the political process when she was in high school. She volunteers as a crisis text line counselor and also conducts research on renewable energy, sustainable development, and global mental health. There is no truth to the rumor that she's on track to find a cure for cancer before she graduates. Xingjing, welcome. That's a very impressive resume.
Thank you so much, and thanks for the invitation to be here.
Chelsea Jones. She's a rising star in the Providence television market. She anchors the weekend news for the CBS affiliate here, WPRI Channel 12, and reports during the week, and graciously donated her day off for us today. She grew up in the Metro D.C. area, graduating from the University of Maryland's Merrill College of Journalism, and worked in Louisiana before heading north here to Rhode Island. Welcome, Chelsea.
Thank you. So excited to be here.
Finally, my good friend on the end, Scott McKay. Scott has been reporting in Rhode Island almost as long as I have, but he's been a journalist a lot longer, cutting his teeth covering Vermont politics when a youngster named Bernie Sanders was elected as mayor of Burlington. Scott and I were colleagues for many years at the Providence Journal, and the last dozen years of his career before retiring, he was a political analyst for our NPR affiliate here in Rhode Island, the Public's Radio. Scott?
Well, thanks an awful lot, Jim. You're being awful nice to me.
Sounds like getting to listen to your own eulogy before you die, right?
Yeah, I don't want to be at my own wake quite yet, old as I am. But I think I was covered the Civil War. Was that when I started?
Yeah, it may have been your first assignment, or when Roger Williams arrived. Although I recommend John's book to everyone, I recommend it particularly to anybody who is over 40. Most of you here have lived the experiences that he writes about and that we'll talk about today. And after reading it, I realized, I sent John an email and I said, I owe my 24-year-old twins a huge apology for really not understanding the critical issues that have faced them growing up like many of you. So my daughter Alex, who now lives and works in New York, when she was a junior in high school, she applied to my alma mater, the University of North Carolina. And we were going back and forth, and she was talking about how difficult it was, and they got 35,000 applications, and she was out of state, so they only took 18%, on and on and on. And I was getting a little tired of hearing all of this, and she said, Dad, you would never be able to get into North Carolina now with your record. And I said, you know what, I probably agree with that, Alex. I had decent grades, okay SATs. I think they grabbed me back in the 70s more because I was from Massachusetts to fill a geographical demographic than my record. But I said, Alex, all that research you do and all the homework you have to do, we didn't have the internet. And that stopped her in her tracks. She said, wow, what? And she thought about that for a minute, and she said, what did you do? And I said, well, some people went to the library, or so I hear. I spent most of my time at the college newspaper office. And at that point, I began to realize the disconnect. She had a greater appreciation for my growing up and some of how I took my path. And now, as I've read John's book, I really appreciate more the path that my kids have taken, and you, as he likes to call them, Generation Z or Zoomers. So, John, with that, why don't you briefly set the table for us on the premise of your book, specifically the half a dozen or so things that have shaped the formative years for the Zoomers, as you like to call them.
Thanks, Jim. And I think that's been one of the lessons as I was thinking about the book, checking with some friends about some of the themes and concepts I was developing. And so many people appreciate that everything we thought we knew about this generation was wrong. Right? And when I think about Zoomers, I'm not the kind of person who says you need to be born on this day and this month and this year to be part of a generation. Generations are created by a group of people coming of age during the same period of time, struck by processing the same series of current events. And Generation Z, or Zoomers, I'm talking about roughly 70 million young Americans who are the most educated, the most diverse in our nation's history, whose ages span from middle school age to folks in this room, and I would argue even on this panel, folks in their mid-20s or so. So it's about that age group, middle school through early to mid-20s. But what's important to appreciate about, I think, Zoomers is that I argue that there's no generation in at least 75 years or so who has dealt with more chaos, more trauma more quickly than this generation. Specifically before what science says, what neurology says, before the human brain is actually fully developed at the age of 25. It's difficult to understand Zoomers when I ask the question of what your favorite memory is of being an American. or what it means to be American, this generation doesn't remember America together as one. Baby boomers had a traumatic experience growing up in the 60s, but they also had Woodstock, Beatlemania, progress on civil rights, and then the moon landing, where all of Americans, regardless of party or partisanship or race or ethnicity, could come together. Similar experiences for my generation, Gen X, as well as millennials. But this generation hasn't had that opportunity. I talk about in the book, there were basically five events I'll mention that I think are shaping the values of this generation, what they care about. The first event is actually not an event that was created by Zoomers. Several of the other ones have been, but this was created by a member of the silent generation, for millennials, influencing Zoomers, which is Occupy Wall Street. When the oldest Zoomers were coming of age, 8th, 9th, 10th grade, their introduction to politics was through, as Scott said, the former mayor of Burlington, Vermont, and others who were talking about economic justice and the 1% versus the 99%. Questioning capitalism is something that's inherent among this generation, the way in which capitalism is practiced. First event. The second event is the 2016 election and the presidency of Donald Trump. Whoever was going to, I think, follow Barack Obama's footsteps would have been a transformational figure, but clearly the Trump presidency has had a profound effect on this generation as they were forced to deal with the issues that his administration was having us confront. And one of the most important aspects of this is he made politics tangible. He made it real. Younger people could see the difference between what a Trump administration looked like versus another administration, Clinton or Biden. And whether you're a Democrat or Republican, that was very, very easy to see. Politics was less opaque and more transparent overnight in terms of the effect. The other three events were the combination, I think, of October 1st, 2017 and February 14, 2018, the Parkland shooting and the Las Vegas massacre really kind of energized March for Our Lives movement, which led to historic turnout in 2018. That doesn't happen. The climate strike movement by Greta Thunberg does not happen without Parkland first. It was a direct response to the school strike, which changed the way in which millions of people around the world think about climate. And the fifth and final event, I think, before COVID or during COVID, that have shaped the values of this generation is what young Darnella Frazier, 17-year-old volleyball and basketball student athlete from Minneapolis did when she held up her cell phone for 10 minutes and taped the murder of George Floyd. Not only did she tape it, she went back to her apartment and told the story on Facebook Live. So something that so many of us have been turning away from. We could no longer see that moment anymore. And those are the 5 events before COVID, including COVID, that I think have impacted the values of this generation.
Thank you, John, for that overview. Xinjiang, can you tell us a little bit about the Harvard Public Opinion Project, how often you do it, what you feel are the most important takeaways from your most recent poll, and I know you have another one coming up, and did any of those results surprise you?
Absolutely. So the Harvard Public Opinion Project is a group of undergraduates at the university's Institute of Politics. We're mentored by Director of Polling John Della Volpe, and it's a really exciting opportunity to have a survey of young Americans really brought to life by young Americans. So essentially, we're a group of around 30 undergrads that meet throughout the semester to go through the entire polling life cycle, from brainstorming questions like, what do we think isn't talked about enough in politics today? Or what's altogether missing from our discourse? To really drafting those questions and sharpening them so that we can portray an accurate picture of our generation and what matters to us. And so there's a lot of refining and sharpening those exact questions and answer choices, but ultimately, once we get the data back, we're in charge of analyzing it, taking a look at not only the top line numbers, but also specific crosstabs. How do these numbers break down by partisan affiliation, by race, racial identity, geographic location, really getting at the multi-layered dimensions of our data And from there, we really put together that cohesive portrait of who we are as a generation, what values and issues matter the most to us, and we have this wonderful opportunity to present our findings to political leaders, student activists and organizations, and really showcase our findings in the hopes that they can inform some future policy decisions and ignite conversations like this with people across all generations. And I think that's really a valuable component of our role in helping to catalyze change and push for an improved and brighter future. So we conduct this poll once every spring and once every fall. This project was actually conceived by 2 undergraduates in the year 2000, so it's been ongoing for over 2 decades. And the initial motivation was just that those 2 students found a disconnect between young people who were very active in their communities through volunteering and service to others, and yet that didn't translate to voting patterns. There was that gap, and they sought to investigate why. And so a one-time survey has evolved into 42 iterations at this point, which has really provided the most comprehensive look at not only the voting trends, but also the overall shape and depiction of Gen Z and millennials today. Our most recent poll was released in December of 2021, and I think there were a couple very striking findings. For one, those overlapping crises that John alluded to earlier in summarizing sort of the last couple decades have really reached a heightened point of concern for a lot of young people in America. So top of mind was that a solid majority of young people believe that in America today, our democracy is either at risk or failing. And that's really striking and worth considering, why that is. Another was that not only is our generation worried about the survival of our democracy, but we're also really concerned about our own survival in terms of climate change and the threats that it poses to our communities. And finally, all of these crises don't just feel collective and societal. They take an individual toll too. And we're seeing incredibly alarming numbers with regard to the mental health crisis that is genuinely ongoing still. And it's point for concern, but also worthy to note that young people recognize the challenges we face, and we're not backing down from them. We're really rising up to take action. And I'm sure we'll get to more of that very soon.
Great. Thank you, Xing. That's a great review. Chelsea, there has been an increasing aggression among the electorate, particularly during the Trump years, and that started in Washington, but it's filtered down all the way to local school committees. We've seen some of that here in Rhode Island with masking and critical race theory and those things that are being brought up. The media has not been insulated from this aggression. What has that been like for you as a reporter covering state and local government, both here and in Louisiana?
Yeah, so I would say that the trends are pretty consistent. So I did work in Monroe, Louisiana, here in Rhode Island. I grew up in DC. So what we see is that things are a bit hostile. In your book, and as you guys have mentioned, for the past 5 years or so specifically, we've not really known a world without trauma. We haven't really known a world where we're not ingesting so many things at once, whether that's George Floyd being murdered on camera or a Trump presidency. So to be a part of the media, especially during that presidency where, we were deemed the enemy, it's been hostile, whether that was here or in Louisiana. The trends are pretty consistent. But the reality stays the same in that, I have a job to do, but as a young Black woman, it's been challenging, for sure.
Did you feel threatened ever in Louisiana?
Yeah. So at that point, then President Trump came down to stomp for a Republican candidate. It was a big governor's race at that point. And like I said, it was a very hostile community. And then to be a young African-American in the South, in the rural South at that, and to be around so many people that are looking at you as a threat or an enemy or a problem, there were moments of, being scared or threatened in a way, doing my job.
Wow.
Yeah.
Scott, let's widen out a little bit with the historical perspective. We are deeply politically polarized in 2020, but is this different from other difficult times in our country's history over the past 2 centuries, or are there similarities?
Well,
And get all that done in 30 seconds.
of course, it could be 30 seconds. I'll tell you the whole world. I think sometimes, as a crusty curmudgeon, I will tell you that the Vietnam era had a lot of activism by young people, maybe as much as there is now. I mean, don't forget, 50,000 American boys died in Vietnam. That's like 50 9/11s, okay? You had racial tensions. You had the murders of John F. Kennedy, of Martin Luther King, of Robert F. Kennedy. Very, very difficult stuff to deal with. You had the rise of feminism. Finally, you know, women were deciding that, no, this isn't a man's world. Come on, I can do anything a man can do except maybe play linebacker. And so what you're looking at here is there was the activism. Now, I think there are some differences. One of them is obviously the internet, where the internet has connected everybody. We used to talk about news cycles. Remember, Jim, when we were young reporters? 24-hour news cycle. Now there's like a 12-second news cycle because everybody's out there interconnected. The problem is, I think the internet was billed as something that would bring the world to your living room. Too often, I think it just brings you to your living room. And people just look at the internet to kind of undergird opinions they already have. So I think that's a big problem. I think to Chelsea's point, the one thing Trump did that I see from my vantage point of having almost 50 years in the media is that Trump took the guardrails off of American life as far as politics goes, and actually as far as just being human beings go. As far as what you could say, racism, sexism, people with disabilities, it just seemed to me that Trump, you know, and all of his really hardcore followers, that they didn't care. And this is happening all over the Western world where people are clinging to older things, religion, things that a culture that comes down from their parents, and they're not really looking at democracy, and that's going to be the biggest problem we have.
Do you think there's anything is there any going back now that the genie's out of the bottle? I mean, we see some Trump clones doing the same thing. Do you think we return, or is that ship sailed in terms of breaking down those guardrails?
A lot of that, I think, will be up to you folks, this generation, because you don't agree. If it wasn't for young people, don't forget, Trump would have won again. If it wasn't for the votes of, and in particular, minority young people, and in particularly of the minority, black women. If you look at the numbers, that's why Joe Biden is president. And I think that cultural changes aren't always dictated by politics, but, you know, sometimes they do kind of rub off on each other. I'm always interested in how ideas get propagated in society and how, you know, people do that. I will say one thing about this generation is that on the mental health aspect, you know, a lot of older people, particularly guys, there was a real stigma in my generation about if you were not doing well mentally, about seeing a therapist for it. Just simple things like that. And I think it's much better nowadays. I think people deal with their feelings better. And we didn't really at all. I mean, Jim, unless you had a really bad substance abuse problem, people just didn't go to get help. And they didn't talk about it in class. And they didn't talk about it at the local student tavern where we used to go to. And they didn't talk about it at the coffee shop. It was kind of like one of those things that was a stigma. It was kind of shame. It was like having cancer 50 years ago, you know? You were ashamed of it somehow, that you were not strong. And I see that this generation, I think, has a much better attitude towards that. I think it's much more healthy, and it's a lot better for society.
But I also want to piggyback off that. I feel like that's so true, but I also feel like because you guys are like the most powerful generation, Gen Z, right? But while we're more open to talking about mental health, I think it's such a big issue because, again, we're ingesting so many traumatic things at such an alarming rate. I mean, right now, I can't think of her name, but there's a woman that people on social media believe killed her boyfriend. And right now, you know, this generation is pushing the nod a little bit, you know, and making that an issue, you know. And I think that you speak about this in your book. Not only is social media so powerful, but you guys are so powerful in that you guys really, if you think it's an issue, you push it, you know. But I also feel like the flip side of that is the mental health issues that we're ingesting and getting because we're looking at things like that so often.
Xingjing, what's that been like on campus? You graduated high school, right, with COVID, and then your first couple of years, is that right, at Harvard? And mental health issues and just going to school in a pandemic, you guys certainly know about that. What's been the vibe on campus up there?
Yeah, it's definitely been a very jarring juxtaposition. So I graduated high school in 2019 before COVID and all of the pandemic-related changes, Zoom school. But my freshman year of college, in the spring, because of the pandemic, we were evacuated from campus. And so there were the jokes of shifting to Zoom University and what that would be like. But I think the current label of Generation Z as the loneliest generation is in many ways accurate. Although we grew up in this advent of the internet and social media, as Scott mentioned, it has been a form of connecting people worldwide, but not necessarily giving them a sense of connection, in that social comparisons become so much more enabled. And you have this constant exposure to politics and sometimes the toxicity that's associated with it, as Chelsea noted. And all of that combined can make taking action online or even just engaging with your friends sometimes draining, even if you're not an introvert like me. But in any regard, I think shifting to Zoom, especially just virtual classes for a year, has absolutely stressed how different it is to be interacting with people through a screen versus face-to-face. And because of that, I believe that our generation has really come to value connection and compassion. And so not only does the Harvard Public Opinion Project conduct these nationwide surveys of 18 to 29-year-olds, but in order to illuminate more of the stories and perspectives that underlie our poll numbers, we also get an exciting chance to sit down with them through focus groups in person, or in the fall of 2020, as an example, we actually hosted a bunch over Zoom with high schoolers nationwide. And we just heard recurring themes of, you know, what makes Generation Z unique? Well, it's the empathy that we have for each other because of all that we've gone through. And, you know, every generation grows up with its own set of challenges. But in spite of the perceived polarization, divisiveness, the rhetoric that can be really tough to deal with sometimes, Generation Z has told us again and again, we've been through so much that we really have compassion for other people. And in our polling numbers, we see this too. We want increased access to healthcare for everyone who needs it. We believe that the government should do more to help people who are struggling with poverty. There's so much of this collective notion of rising together that I think is absolutely inspiring and empowering.
John, that dovetails into my next question. You wrote an article last month called The 5 Myths About Generation Z. Can you talk about that?
Sure. Well, I'll touch upon a couple of them. One myth is that they don't vote, right? And, you know, if that was the bet you were going to take for, you know, the last 3 or 4 generations, you would have made some money, you know. But this generation, Gen Z, has shown otherwise.
And so, Hillary Clinton found that out the hard way in 2008, didn't she?
She found that out. So, yeah, let's talk about that for one quick second. So that would be mostly a millennial vote. But in Iowa, the only way Barack Obama was going to win that primary was to, quote, expand the franchise, right? Expand the number of people. And he did 2 things. He reached out to Republicans who could disaffiliate for the evening and caucus, and he reached out to 17, 18-year-olds. 17-year-olds can vote in that caucus, and as well as other young people. A couple of nights before the caucus, there was big event called the Jefferson-Jackson Dinners, and Hillary Clinton's campaign advisors were crowing how confident they were, that they looked around the auditorium and that the auditorium looked like their side, looked like Iowa. And what they said was his side, Obama's side, looked like Facebook. In other words, yeah, Facebook, they're on social media, they don't vote, they don't care. Well, what happened was Obama won 55% of that, quote, Facebook vote, lost everybody over the age of 30, and Hillary Clinton won 10% of that Facebook vote. And Obama had won that race. The next week in New Hampshire, she did better among younger people and won that primary. So if not for literally just a handful, a couple of hundred or a few thousand millennials, I think the country is in a different place. Hillary Clinton would have won Iowa, New Hampshire, and her campaign perhaps would have been correct, and it would have been wrapped up by Super Tuesday. Obviously, that's not what happened. So one is they don't vote, right?
What about the other four?
The other four are, one of which is there are a bunch of socialists who hate America. I think we're seeing that to vote and to be active in the ways in which Jing Jing and Chelsea have mentioned shows by definition they don't hate America. And only 39% actually would self-classify as liberal or progressive. So their definition, their values look more progressive, but that's another big one. And I think one other one that's important, I think, when we think about the politics of the day, is that they're not looking for like political purity. They are open to compromise. They're open to negotiation. And I think too many legislators and other elected officials and administration members, et cetera, think that the only way into the heart of a young voter is to legalize weed everywhere and cancel 100% of student debt. Okay? In fact, in a Harvard polling a couple of years ago, we've got another one coming out in a couple of weeks, those are far more nuanced conversations, okay, that young people are looking forward to having. So another myth is that you can actually have a meaningful conversation and dialogue, and as long as the values of the generation are aligned with the values of the elected officials or campaigns, then they will vote for you. No better example of that than, of course, Joe Biden, who did not really poll so well with younger people during the primary, but through conversation and in that process, performed only second to Obama in 2008. More young people turned out than ever.
One thing I'm interested in, and Jing Jing, John, and Chelsea probably know more about this than I do, which is how do young people today who don't go to college, what is the political profile of folks who go to the military or go to work? How does that differ from folks sitting in auditoriums like this one?
Well, I think there are a couple ways to think of that. One is every single spring we ask 13 or 14, 15 questions around political typology, ideology, values. Okay? And on every single question, over the 15 years we've been asking this series, every single year, the responses are becoming slightly more progressive. Okay? So, for example, on issues related to gun violence and gun control, Republicans have shifted 20 points, okay, on that issue over the last several years. Okay, Democrats, Independents as well. So the entire group is changing. On issues related to, like, I'll give you one other example, which I think is interesting: school choice. Okay, school choice has been the one area where younger people have been slightly more conservative than their parents. Okay, when you look at that politics. However, there is actually no difference between the way a Democrat and a Republican under 30 think about the issue of school choice.
Wow.
There's no difference. There is a 30-point difference in the way a young Democrat and an older Democrat would think about that issue.
Sure.
Right? So the point is that people, whether they are in college or heading towards the military, really don't abide by the traditional labels that people like us oftentimes try to have stick with them, that they values voters first.
Jing Jing. Gen Z and the millennials helped deliver Joe Biden victory in 2020, as John said. And your poll showed that this time last year they were generally supportive of his policies. But the Democrats have suffered some self-inflicted wounds, with the progressives and moderates having sharp disagreements on policy issues. What's changed? I know your poll's coming out, not quite there yet. You're crunching the numbers. What's changed over the last year, and what role do you see Gen Z, millennials playing in the midterm elections?
Yeah, Gen Z and millennials are going to have a really critical role for whoever wants to do well in the midterms. I think if you look at our poll numbers from last spring, Joe Biden was at a 59% approval, which was really impressive given how uncertain the 2020 Democratic primaries were and the sense of unknown as to who was going to win the 2020 presidential race. But just 6-ish months later, in the fall, we saw those approval numbers decline 13 percentage points down to 46%. So that was really an indicator for us that Joe Biden had exited his honeymoon period. And he campaigned on a lot of promises for young people. And one with the sense that he told young people he heard them and he valued them and they believed and they delivered for him. But young people are not just a block to be appeased once every 4 years or even every 2. They really, really, truly value a candidate who prioritizes what's important to them. And we see that Biden's approval on issues like COVID, the frustration surrounding the government response there, even as this pandemic drags into its 3rd year, concerns about how he's handled Ukraine and foreign policy, Afghanistan in particular, the withdrawal. There's a lot of frustration with how he's done and also how there's this lack of communication sometimes and that people don't feel like, young people don't feel as though they're adequately represented at times. Although he's taken those concerns to heart, and we see with the nomination of Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson, there's a lot of reasons for young people who tell us, you know, I'm hopeful when I see people like me represented in politics. He's really making a difference there. So that's perhaps room for optimism for the future. But I think just overall, if Biden wants to do well, if the Republicans want to do well, they do, of course, then there's a lot of really seeing what young people desire and being willing to push for change. We see from our most recent fall 2021 poll that there's desires for increased government action on climate change, for support for mental health access and reducing that stigma. Really just championing what we seek for our future, a more equitable, inclusive, and hopeful future. That's going to take some work, but we can by all means get there.
I got a quick question, which is simply, are young voters who have a real reputation, some of it earned, some of it not, going to turn out in the midterms? Because too often we see young voters turning out for the presidential election, and then 2 years later, seems like there must be a keg party somewhere on election day because the young people do not turn out in the same numbers they do for the presidential.
Can we ask the room? Who's going to turn out in the midterm election? Okay. If that happens,
Pretty good.
if that happens, that's going to be historic again.
But the question is, how many of you are you from out of state? Right? So are you going to the effort of getting the mail ballot and doing all of that? It's easy to say you're doing it, but how many are going to follow through with that process? Not so many, right?
So listen, when your parents and grandparents were your age, 82 out of 100 stayed home, didn't vote. Okay? Overall turnout in midterm elections was average 16 points, 16% turnout for baby boomers, for Gen X, and for millennials, between 14 to 15 and as high as 20-point turnout. So what happened was in 2018, when Zoomers came of age the first time, with this increasing level of anxiety, one way in which they dealt with this anxiety was to vote. And you had a doubling of the 2018 turnout was a doubling of the 2014 turnout. Okay, still a lot of room to grow. I mean, doubling of 16, 17%
Yeah,
was
it's
in the
not
mid-30s.
much, right.
Was in the mid-30s, okay? But it's twice as much as like my generation and your generation, and if you're a millennial. And then in 2020, they did the same thing for the first time in history. College students like yourselves voted at the same level as the average American.
Right.
College students. So one of the myths is that, like I said, the old myth was that young people don't vote just doesn't ring true anymore. And it is your participation that we have a first African-American female on the Supreme Court. That does not happen unless people in this room and your older brothers and sisters turn out. Arizona, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, and Georgia, as you mentioned, Scott. Donald Trump won the vote of everybody who wasn't a millennial or a Zoomer. Okay? It's only the younger people who lifted Biden by a 20-point margin, okay, to make that difference. Same thing with the Georgia Senate race. So this generation has so much to be proud of in terms of the impact, not just in Iowa in 2007, 2008, but in this country today. But the last thing I'd say is, I'm not sure that President Biden makes gun violence the primary issue of today in terms of what he's doing around ghost guns and the ATF director, if not for the pressure of young people like you, like everyone on this panel, and the students with March for Our Lives. So the impact you're making is already extraordinary.
Just quickly, are the Republicans paying enough attention to, if the formula is get the young vote out, or have they given that up? Because, look, I went to school in the South, and the college Republicans were pretty strong down there, and the demographics depend on where you are in the country. But isn't that the generation that some of the Republicans should go after? Or are they just like, we're not aligned politically?
Georgia, I used to, for many years, for Republicans to win on a national basis, you needed basically just to keep a Democrat below 60%, okay, among younger people. So John Kerry got 55% of the youth vote. Hillary Clinton got 55% of the youth vote. Biden got 60%. Obama got 66 and 60%. Now what's happened, so you didn't need to win, you just had to be somewhat competitive. But now what's happened, Jim, is now you have two generations who are coming of age, who have not been basically, Republicans have not made an effort to communicate with them. It's now 40% of the electorate. 40% of the electorate are millennials or Gen Z, and Republicans have a significant problem on a national basis because they haven't put that hard work in to kind of establish a relationship with them. And that is going to continue to do real damage. We think about this country being 50-50, it is. But it's 2/3 of people under 40 think one way, and 2/3 of people over 60 think another way. Yeah. And every day, an older, more conservative, less active person is aging out and being backfilled by younger, diverse, educated, active voters who have a very different set of values.
Chelsea, you grew up in the Metro D.C. area, you lived in Louisiana, and now you're here. Similarities, differences in terms of the issues for your generation in those different parts of the country? I know it's a little different because you're a reporter, you're not a native of down there, but what did you see in living in different parts of the country?
I would say the trends are consistent. We care about the same things, or you see that people care about the same things, especially amongst the Gen Z millennials. Like I said, I think like the Black Lives Matter movement, very important across the board. Doesn't matter where you live. Rights as simple as abortion, as we talk about, that debate is really hot right now. But I think what we find in Louisiana, in DC, here, is that whatever people believe, one way or the other, they're going to say something about it. They add pressure to local government, federal government, they turn out to vote. And I think what I was going to say to your point earlier is just that I think that this generation will try anything once, So right after, President Obama was done, and there was a lot of discourse that we were seeing in the media from the communities that we serve, Louisiana, and even in D.C. And then, people voted for Trump, and then he did his 4 years, and people were like, you know what, I'm not really feeling that. And so I think what this generation will do is, like, whatever they believe, one way or another, they're going to speak about it. They're going to go out, protest about it. You see it on social media. And then whatever happens, happens. So in the midterms or in the next election, depending on how President Biden moves with some of these hot button issues, whether it's guns or mental health and student loans, if this generation feels like he's not doing enough, he might not get another term. So I think that's what I see across different states anyway.
You know, my twins were, I think they were sophomores when Donald Trump got elected. And I said the day after, I mean, they were kind of blindsided, like, how can this guy get elected? And I said to my son, Cameron, what's it like on campus? And he said, it's like the day after we lost to Villanova in the national championship. He said, everybody's walking around, they're all mopey. And I said to my daughter, I said, look, I have the benefit of age. They're giving the keys to the Republicans for 4 years. Let's see what they can do. And a lot of people said, well, how bad can it be? Well, they had buyer's regret with Donald Trump, but you saw very quickly that the House shifted over because the Republicans, except for the tax cut, couldn't get anything done in that first 2 years. So for people, and I don't mean to talk down to you, but I'm seeing a lot of my daughter and you, there was a lot of, you don't see the long run, that eventually it's going to come back. And I'm really interested to see. I mean, everybody's saying that the Republicans are definitely going to be taking the House and maybe the Senate, but I don't know. Scott, let me, we're about 5 minutes away from your participation. Scott, you and I are the resident boomers here, the boomers and the zoomers. And when we started out in newspapers, they were newspapers were it. And they were the primary source of information. And you made that transition over to radio, but you did a lot of writing. What role did social media play in your last 10 years of your career?
What social media has done, part of it, I think, is a problem. Social media has made the media too focused on superficial things, number one. Number two, it's made reporters push, and Chelsea even probably backsteps some of this. It pushes reporters to be first with a story. That's always happened. But now, too often, speed trumps accuracy. And you see even good news organizations like CNN, go out there and make a mistake on Obamacare Supreme Court decision because they wanted to be first and get out there first.
They didn't know to read the last page of the decision rather than the first page.
Well, that's probably true. And the other problem is the cable world. What cable television and these shows do, unfortunately, the way to make money is to have a bunch of celebrity talking heads out there. And that's a problem. You make a lot of money doing that, but all you do is have people spewing opinions. Whereas back in the day, as you'll remember, you used to spend money on reporting. Well, guess what? That costs money. Somewhere like CBS News used to have a bureau in Paris, a bureau in London. I mean, they would spend the money to send, 5 or 6 reporters to Vietnam. And nowadays, unless there's a war or some huge conflagration somewhere, a nuclear power plant blows up or something, we don't cover the world very much. And I think it's made Americans more parochial, that unless you read the New York Times every day, which I do, although lately I feel like snorting a couple of Prozacs in the morning before I pick it up because the Ukrainian news, it's just so horrible. But we really don't, as a country, have that same, first of all, we don't teach civics enough. And we have too much historical illiteracy, which unfortunately we've got to do something to combat. And that's the real change in the media that I saw just doing my little commentary and covering things here in, our watery slice of New England.
Right. It was always get it first, but get it right. And a lot of people
Precisely.
forget the get it right part. And the news cycle used to be, when I started in television in the mid-'90s, I covered some of the primaries up in New Hampshire. They would do one event.
That's right.
And it would basically be geared toward the 6:30 national news. And then with the advent of the cable television, they had to feed the beast and do 3 or 4 or 5 events.
Used to be, remember we used to talk about a 24-hour news cycle, as I said previously. Now it's a 12-second news cycle.
Yeah. If any of you have questions and want to make your way up, we have microphones over here and over here. If anybody has a question, come on up, or we'll keep going. I know you're just busting. Do we have leverage here, like you get bonus points or you get, you get a D if you don't
Well,
ask
don't
a
forget,
question.
we're pollsters. Two of us are pollsters. We love to ask questions of you guys as well. So
Go ahead.
I could do that if necessary.
You know, they make a living asking questions, so.
Let me do this while we're waiting, and certainly, again, make your way up if you want. John, when you look at the contrast between millennials and Zoomers, what do you see as the major difference when it comes to having an impact on the political climate?
Yeah, thanks. It's so I think the similarities are these kind of shared values and perspectives when it comes to partisanship and it comes to the issues that we've talked about. I think the difference between the two is really, I think, focus on the kind of the urgency of this moment. Really kind of driven, I think, and inspired by Emma Gonzalez and David Hogg and the Parkland students. You know, that experience for those students to lose 17 of their friends, 15 students, and 2 faculty members, it took 6 minutes. Right? I literally waited more than 6 minutes to get a coffee at the airport yesterday. In that time, the gunman left his Uber, walked in, murdered 17, and walked out 6 minutes. And what was interesting about that day is David Hogg was a relatively new student there, and he had his family had moved from Los Angeles area to Florida. His father was a federal law enforcement officer, thinking about retirement. And they chose Parkland and Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School because it was known to have facilities for TV production and debate. And they were like just a storytelling family. So thankfully, he had his cell phone working and was able to capture that video and just insisted to his parents that he get back, really just to help console his sister and to feel like he could be productive of some kind. He insisted that he get back to the school as all the news media and the cable outlets were there. And it went on Fox News, actually, for the first time. Laura Ingram's show was the first show to have him on. And she was trying to talk about
It's kind of ironic how it went down
here's
the line, right?
Here's the thing, Jim, right? She was asking him a question about where the killer sat at lunch. She wanted to know what group. Was he an outcast? Was he this? Was he that? He didn't answer it. And he said, here's my message. If you don't think it's going to happen to you, you're wrong. It can happen to anybody. And the only way to stop it is if all of us understand that and we all rise up and do something about that. You know, and that was the beginning, and it kind of gave voice and gave confidence to so many people. That I think is just such a formative event and experience. And I just don't think, you know, millennials chose to work outside the system more, right? It was the beginning of Silicon Valley and social media, and they try to do good things, but basically kind of from outside the system rather than inside the system. And the difference between millennials and Zoomers is Zoomers are working inside the system as well as outside the system as well. And now I'm really excited, you know, especially with I'm getting feedback, and there were a lot of these first-generation organizers for Parkland who are running for office. You know, Val Demings in Orlando. Yeah. Right, is one of the organizers, and in many places around the country where millennials were inspired by Obama, 9/11. Now we have a new generation just coming of age to run for office, inspired by that activism, which I think is a great thing.
Jing and Chelsea, as Zoomers, I'm curious, you know, this led to my apologies to my twins. I didn't really think about it. The recession in 2008, you guys were younger, climate change. We haven't even talked about climate change today. Gun violence, George Floyd, the opioid crisis, Parkland, and all of that. Do you know, when you read John's book, it crystallizes that, and that's really all that you've known. I wonder if you think about previous, I mean, is that just something you live with and say, this is kind of the way life is? And do you wonder what the earth is going to be like in 30 years when Scott and I are, unless we find some miracle thing, we're not going to be around? You know, my generation's not thinking about that as much. How much does that weigh on you? Specifically climate change.
Yeah, it's very ever present, and I think the time is now is very much a sentiment that a lot of Zoomers share, and it's really in response to all of these crises. You have the Parkland shooting that John commented on earlier, David Hogg and his colleagues' work actually inspired me to start letter writing campaigns at my high school. So those ripple effects of activism do form. And I think even with all of these weights on our shoulders, with everything that's chaotic around us, I think what Gen Z has really come to embrace is how we're going to take action however we can. So that's not confined to the ballot box at all. We're going to vote and we're going to push our friends to vote, but our youth poll, the Harvard Youth Poll that's been conducted for the last 20 years or so, has found just a steady increase in the proportion of young Americans who identify as politically active. We reached a new high of like 37% in the fall of 2020, which remained pretty steady, 36% in the spring of 2021. And that was around 10 percentage points higher than it had been 10 years ago. So comparing Gen Z and millennials there, you see Gen Z going at it with signing petitions, posting about such petitions on social media, leading protests and attending those kinds of sit-ins and such. But also that we recognize there are flaws in some of those forms of taking action. We're very wary of performative activism on social media. You know, just sharing a post about a rally or telling a friend to vote, that's not enough. We need to take substantive action, and we need to push our leaders to do more, especially with the issues that we care about. But even though there is that urgency and that sense that the government isn't doing enough, so we need to drive our leaders to do more, there is no sense of resignation. Young people believe in their own individual agency. A sizable majority think that for climate change, individual actions do matter in combating the crisis. Even as government action is lagging or absent, we still think that acting as members of our communities is still efficacious. With regard to mental health, as a volunteer crisis text line counselor, you hear so much about the texters who reach out to us. A lot of them actually are in the Gen Z millennial cohort. That's just kind of the demographic that is comfortable with reaching out to the text line. And so many of them just say, it's nice to feel heard and supported. Like, I don't know you, I've never seen you in person, but just knowing that you're there for me and that I can just talk openly about what's on my mind, like, it means a lot. So even those small, just daily actions you can take make a really substantive impact. And whether it be at the polls or in your conversations with friends, you can truly reshape how our future is going to look.
At the same time, I believe that this generation doesn't even know what the American dream is. You know, all we know is activism. All we know is having to fight for what we believe in, or, you know, the causes that we think matter. And if you think about first-gen Americans, Black Americans, you know, all we know is inequity and inequality. And so we're fighting because we feel like we finally have that voice and we finally can say something and take what our ancestors and what our parents have done to kind of push things forward. But at the end of the day, like, what is the American dream? I don't think this generation knows. They're just fighting in hopes that one day maybe we know what that is. So I think that's...
One of the questions I was going to ask is, that's exactly what I was going to ask, which is, what is your definition of, like we say, best life? You know, I'd be interested if anyone who wants to kind of share that, because I think it's very different, Chelsea, than what like my generation would have said, or some others. Well, we have a question, Jim.
Question over here.
Hi, thank you. My name is Bernie, and I'm a millennial. I'd like to ask you a speculative question.
Welcome.
Thank you.
I'm Bernie, and I'm a millennial.
I thought it was funny. So I asked you a speculative question. Can you imagine the future a few years from now, and Donald Trump has been reelected to a non-contiguous second term? What's the reaction on the part of Gen Z?
I did see something online the other day that said he would have to admit that he lost the election in 2020. Otherwise, that would be 2 consecutive terms. Right?
Who wants that? Yes. I think, well, I think that, Gen Z and millennials will obviously try to prevent that from happening, right? But, so that's that's number one. I think number two is that you see, sadly, a return of some of the issues I talked about in this book. We started the conversation earlier about systemic racism, bullying, these sorts of things. You know, there is a pretty strong correlation between, we talked about giving permission for folks, and what happened, there's been a lot of academic studies around this, and what happens when leaders give permission to people to everything from being rude to service workers who aren't their race or ethnicity, to the impact in communities where there's increasing levels of racism, or in schools where there was increasing levels of bullying in places where voted for Trump versus non. I think it does real harm to the society, right? And what I learned through my own research of this is all those events, yes, they add stress, but they also make us physically less well, right? And like your daughters, you talked about like the next day, and my daughters and so many others, literally physically less well because of the concerns they had, not just for themselves, Jim, like our kids will be fine, okay? They were concerned, I would argue, without knowing your kids, right, about other people and the vulnerable. So I think what happens is, I think you have a less well society, part one. On the other hand, I think that would be hopefully the final wake-up call to have increasing levels of participation to prevent that from happening, right? So those are two of the different scenarios I could potentially see kind of playing out.
Would there be a hole big enough for you guys to climb into if that happened?
We'll see.
Anybody else? Did you have a follow-up question or not? Good.
Can I add on to that?
Sure.
Yeah, so our spring 2021 survey actually asked the young Americans we poll if they could give, at that point, former President Donald Trump a rating as to best president ever, like average president, the worst, and he scored pretty dismally. I think one really standout question that we also included in that year's survey was if you feel included in Biden's America, and then if you feel included in Trump's. And we just see this jarring contrast. Many more Americans felt, even before Biden had reached his 100th day, that they would feel comfortable and safer in Biden's version of the country. And so looking at America, the American dream, but also who we are as a society, even amongst young Republicans, at that point in 2021, there was a sense that they didn't want Trump to play a key role in the future of Republican politics. So he is that just contentious and somewhat controversial figure, even for young Americans on the right. But what we also see is that even if he gets elected in 2024, looking at 2020, many of the Gen Zers and millennials that we had the fortune of getting their opinions on said that the 2020 election catalyzed their interest in politics. And so that record spike we saw with political engagement amongst young people, looking at how maybe Trump was a figure who pushed a lot of people to care more about politics because of his very divisive and sometimes difficult to hear rhetoric, because of the way his policies really dominated the media, people started to pay attention. And I think if he does win, there's going to be a lot of uproar on the side of the Democrats as to how this could happen. But also, I think more broadly, zooming out, there's going to be a reckoning of, who do we want our America to be? Is it going to be inclusive and embrace identities and make people feel welcome? Or is it going to feel the opposite? And that is very much up to young people's reaction to that prospect. But I think the mobilization you'll see on all sides and transcending political divides, but the kind of action that's taken, the conversations that are started online and in person, the sort of politics matters sentiment is absolutely going to surge, regardless of who we're talking about.
Scott, do you see a scenario where that might happen, or do you think, I see more likely that there might be some Republican candidate, not necessarily Donald Trump, could take the White House in 2024? I mean, I know we got a lot of way to go between now and then.
Well, from one perspective, I will say that a competent Donald Trump would be worse for the country than Donald Trump was. If you think about some Republican who actually is not a lunatic, doesn't tweet 24 hours a day, but still has some of the same views as Trump. Trumpism right now, it's almost like a big piece of the Republican Party has become a cult. And I mean, I grew up in New England. My dad was a Republican. I mean, it was never like this. And there's still a slight piece of New England Republicanism left if you look at the governors of Vermont, Phil Scott, the governors of Massachusetts, Charlie Baker before him, Romney, and Bill Weld. In New Hampshire, Sununu, who's conservative, but he's not crazy.
Larry Hogan?
I'm just talking New England here,
Yeah,
but
Larry
yeah,
Hogan.
Larry Hogan, but
Yep.
they just had to override his abortions. I just don't know, because I don't want to be an idiot, because everybody in the media who thought they knew didn't know, except for a few people. Bernie Sanders was actually one of them. Didn't realize the alienation on the part of a lot of people who suffered after 2008, particularly even union workers, the blue-collar people, places like Michigan, the Rust Belt. I mean, these folks were just so ticked off, and that they went for Trump. They're like, let's try something new. I'm like, you know, and I was astounded at how many Bernie Sanders supporters in some of those Midwestern states actually ended up voting for Trump. It was just bizarre if you looked at it ideologically, but if you looked at the question that people ask as they get older in politics, it's not what kind of a country do I want to embrace all the time. It's my life. What are these guys doing for me?
Yeah.
You know, you get older, you start paying taxes, maybe you have kids, and you're not as worldly. Your concerns are, you know, they're more what Tip O'Neill used to call the kitchen table issues. He used to say, listen, you know, don't give me diagrams, don't give me statistics about the economy. This is something people know about at the kitchen table. You know, my son or my nephew or my niece just lost some hours, just got their hours cut. This guy I know just got unemployed. The labor guys who used to work for the, you know, the iron workers. Well, all of a sudden they thought they were going to do this big project, but now they're not going to do it. So I think that, you know, you have to take the long view sometimes. Although I do admire the kind of idealism that's out there today among young people, and I think it's real. And thank Jingjing and John, of course, for doing these kind of polling, because I think it really helps us get a better view than the anecdotal stuff we too often get from journalism. I have to be honest with you.
John, you get the last 2 minutes.
Just to put real context to what Scott said, I was blown away a decade ago, okay, when I was in Memphis, Tennessee. We were talking about this a little bit earlier, with a bunch of folks about my age, a decade ago, early 40s, but the one thing we all had in common is we had younger kids.
Right.
Okay, and you talk about all high school age kids. And I was going to initially talk about politics of some kind, but before I could do that, I was just checking in with all the other, they're all dads. And one after another, this was during the Obama administration, indicated how challenging it was to basically to literally keep a roof over their head.
Yeah.
And and I didn't, as much as I think I'm in kind of contact with folks through our research, it's striking when you hear someone who moves to Memphis to work at UPS, right? And he literally couldn't take any more hours to work.
FedEx,
right? UPS and FedEx, both of them were there, right? Okay. His wife had left him. I talk about this in the book, and he was literally selling the possessions in his home to keep a roof over his head, just to keep a roof over his head. You know, first it was his drum kit, then it was his motorcycle, and then it got worse. And then almost everyone in this group, okay, had the same sort of experience, okay. And what I hope to do with this research right, is to bring those stories to life, right, is to make the polling data kind of human. And the more that we do that, the more that elected officials can connect with those folks, those values, and now their kids, so they can understand their values and then engage them. Because unless they have that empathy, you can't treat any of these folks like a transactional kind of politics. They're going to give them this or give them that. And that's like the lesson, to talk about these stories. So I would encourage folks to ask questions, you know, through your professors, through your other students, and through other members of this community about these kinds of questions in terms of what's your best life, how are things going, et cetera. You're going to learn so much that I think it helps you later on in life.
All right, let's hear it for the panel.
Wow, thank you. I have to say, listening to the panelists today, I definitely have hope for our future. And looking at that question, how can Gen Z transform U.S. politics? Clearly a lot. And so I look forward to see what you are going to do for our future. I want to thank our panelists today for joining us to discuss the values that have shaped today's generation. Thank you to Jim Hummel for his expertise in allowing everyone to be heard and to speak their truth. Thank you to our audience for joining us in order for your voices to be heard and for continuing to support the spirit and thought of John Sawales and the College of Arts and Sciences. We do have a gift that we'll be giving to our panelists to thank you for coming. Lisa Carlson and her crew, Professor Kevin DeJesus, who really started the Media and Politics Cafe, thank you for continuing this, the spirit of this here at John Sawales. And I do hope that the Harvard Youth Poll will poll some of our students and to create a partnership here. We have a lot of undergraduate research and students who are excited about that, so we would love to create a tradition with you. So thank you. If it was, I probably already ate it, so I'm going to say no.